At 42, I, Nick, believed my 16-year marriage to Evelyn was a sanctuary of absolute trust, a beautiful lie that blinded me for over a decade. But everything shattered on a rainy autumn night at the Seattle Medical Gala. It took just one careless mistake. My wife left her unlocked phone on the vanity, a glowing trigger that unleashed an irreversible nightmare. What did I find in those hidden folders? A master blackmail ledger, encrypted surveillance videos of her with my boss, and a secret offshore account holding millions in hush money. Within 48 hours, my career, my freedom, and my daughter were violently ripped away. And the architect of my ruin? Evelyn, who at that very moment was calmly sipping her chamomile tea, completely unaware that I was about to expose her dark empire to the world. Before I tell you what happened next, if you enjoy stories about justice and family boundaries, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. The Seattle Convention Center was a towering monument of glass and steel, reflecting the cold drizzle of a late autumn evening. Inside, the annual Pacific Northwest Medical Gala was in full swing, a sea of black tuxedos and glittering designer gowns. Over 600 of the region's most influential figures drifted across the polished marble floors, clutching crystal flutes of champagne and exchanging practiced, superficial smiles. Evelyn looked absolutely breathtaking in a backless black silk gown that clung to her curves, her auburn hair swept up in an elegant twist that exposed the delicate line of her neck. To anyone watching us, we were the picture of suburban success, the brilliant humanitarian doctor and her supportive, quiet husband. She played her part with terrifying grace, laughing at the jokes of hospital board members and speaking with humble passion about her fictional medical mission. I walked half a step behind her, my hands tucked into the pockets of my tailored trousers, feeling the cold weight of the flash drive resting against my thigh. Every nod I gave, every polite smile I offered, was a calculated performance. Beneath my calm exterior, my mind was running through the security protocols of the building's central network. I had spent the last 48 hours studying the blueprint of the convention center's automated systems, and I knew exactly where the vulnerabilities lay. I excused myself from a conversation, claiming I needed to check on a minor server issue. Instead, I navigated the quiet back corridors of the venue, heading straight for the main audiovisual control booth on the second tier. My administrative security credentials got me past the checkpoints without a single question. When I reached the heavy door of the control room, I found a young technician sitting before a massive console of glowing monitors. I offered him a warm, professional smile, explaining that the chief of staff had requested a last-minute diagnostic run on the main projection feeds. He stepped aside obligingly, grateful for the assistance of a senior IT security officer. Within 3 minutes, I had covertly installed a remote access rootkit into the primary media server, giving my laptop absolute control over every screen and speaker in the grand ballroom. At exactly 8 o'clock, the house lights dimmed, and Dr. Julian Thorne stepped up to the podium on the main stage. The crowd fell silent, their attention captured by his commanding presence and smooth, reassuring voice. He began his annual address, speaking eloquently about the sacred bond of medical ethics, the importance of community trust, and the clean, unblemished integrity required of those who hold human lives in their hands. The hypocrisy of his words hung in the air like a foul scent. I stood in the darkened AV booth, watching him through the double-paned observation window. I quietly locked the heavy soundproof door from the inside, slipping the brass key into my pocket. The technician turned to me, his brow furrowing in confusion, but before he could speak, I opened my laptop and executed the override sequence. The massive, high-definition projection screens behind Thorne suddenly flickered, cutting off his slides. A low hum vibrated through the state-of-the-art sound system, and then, the video began to play. The footage from the Meridian estate was crystal clear, filling the giant screens with the intimate, scandalous images of my wife and Dr. Marcus Kane. The audio of their whispered promises and breathless sighs echoed with brutal clarity through the cavernous room. A collective, suffocating gasp rippled through the audience of 600 people. Thorne froze at the podium, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he stared up at the evidence of his secret empire. Before anyone could move to shut the system down, the video transitioned to a stark, black and white spreadsheet. It was the master blackmail ledger, scrolling slowly for everyone to see, displaying the names, official titles, and exact dollar amounts of the dozens of prominent guests who had paid Thorne to bury their sins. The ballroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. People stood up from their tables, shouting, pointing, and frantically pulling out their phones to record the unfolding disaster. Across the room, I saw Evelyn staring at the screen, her face completely drained of color, her hands trembling so violently that her champagne glass shattered on the hardwood floor. Marcus Kane tried to push his way through the panicked crowd toward the exit, but his path was instantly blocked by his wife, Clara, flanked by two stern-faced process servers who handed him a thick stack of legal documents. I shut my laptop, unlocked the booth door, and walked out into the corridor. As I descended the grand staircase, looking down at the utter ruin of the lives of those who had betrayed me, I felt a cold, quiet sense of accomplishment. I believed, in that fleeting moment, that justice had finally been served. The cool autumn air hit my face as I walked out of the Seattle Convention Center, leaving the chaotic hum of the ruined gala behind me. The rain had turned into a steady, freezing downpour, washing over the windshield of my SUV as I sat in the driver's seat, waiting. Evelyn did not run to the car. She arrived escorted by two security guards, her face a pale, frozen mask of humiliation under the harsh streetlights. The drive back to Bellevue was defined by a suffocating, absolute silence, broken only by the rhythmic, hypnotic slap of the windshield wipers. When we finally crossed the threshold of our home, the facade crumbled. Evelyn did not cry or beg for forgiveness. Instead, her shock transformed into a sharp, venomous rage. She stood in the center of our living room, her expensive black gown dripping water onto the hardwood floor, her eyes boring into mine with a terrifying intensity. She whispered that I had no idea what I had just done, that the people in that room were not just doctors and administrators, but the very fabric of the city's power structure. I ignored her warnings, fueled by the righteous satisfaction of a soldier who had successfully executed a mission. I slept on the study couch that night, clutching the quiet hope that my 9-year-old daughter, Chloe, would somehow be spared the fallout of our collapsed marriage. Throughout the following day, the silence was deafening. No phone calls came from the hospital, no security alerts, nothing. It was the eerie, heavy quiet that precedes a devastating artillery strike. I tried to focus on routine, cleaning the kitchen, helping Chloe with her homework, and pretending that the world had not shifted on its axis. But the illusion of my victory lasted exactly 36 hours. On Monday morning, as I stood in the kitchen packing a paper bag with Chloe's favorite lunch, the peaceful domesticity of our home was shattered. There was no knock, no polite request to step outside. The heavy oak front door splintered inward with a deafening crash that shook the very foundations of the house. Heavily armed federal agents in tactical gear flooded the hallway, their weapons raised and their voices screaming conflicting commands that drowned out the morning birds outside. Before I could even raise my hands in surrender, I was slammed face-first onto the cold kitchen tile floor. A heavy tactical boot pressed brutally into my upper back, pinning me down as cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around my wrists, cutting off the circulation. Chloe screamed from the top of the stairs, her terrified, high-pitched cries piercing through the shouting of the agents. I yelled for her to stay in her room, but my voice was muffled by the floor. As they dragged me out of my home and down the concrete driveway into the blinding morning light, I saw Evelyn standing near the edge of the lawn. She was not crying, and the shock from 2 nights ago was entirely gone. Beside her stood a sleek black sedan, and as our eyes met, I saw a cold, victorious smirk play on her lips. It was only then, as I was shoved into the cramped, dark back seat of an unmarked transport vehicle, that the horrifying reality began to dawn on me. The ledger I had displayed at the gala did not just expose a cheating ring, it threatened the careers of federal prosecutors, wealthy developers, and the very judges who ran the local courts. The corrupt system was not going to fall. It was simply closing ranks to crush the man who had dared to pull back the curtain, and I was about to find out exactly how helpless a single honest man could be against a machine built on stolen secrets. The steel doors of the holding cell closed with a heavy, mechanical clang that resonated through the soles of my feet, a sound that seemed to finalize the transition from my comfortable life in Bellevue to the grim reality of federal custody. The intake process at the SeaTac Federal Detention Center had been a systematic stripping away of my humanity, designed to break my spirit before I ever stood in front of a judge. They had taken my civilian clothes, my wedding ring, and the small pocket watch my father had given me when I joined the Marines, replacing them with a coarse, oversized orange jumpsuit that smelled of cheap laundry detergent and old sweat. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a relentless, high-pitched frequency that vibrated inside my skull, casting a sickly greenish hue over the concrete walls. I sat on the narrow metal bench, my hands resting on my knees, forcing myself to breathe in slow, measured cycles. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. It was a technique I had learned in the military to keep panic at bay, a way to anchor my mind when the world around me was descending into chaos. My mind kept flashing back to the image of Chloe standing at the top of the stairs, her small face twisted in terror as those armed men dragged her father away in handcuffs. The memory was a physical ache in my chest, far worse than the tight metal cuffs that had bruised my wrists during the transport. I had spent my entire career in cybersecurity protecting networks from external threats, believing that the systems we built were designed to safeguard the innocent. Now, I was beginning to realize that those same systems could be easily weaponized to protect the guilty. The silence of the holding cell was absolute, broken only by the occasional distant shout of a guard or the clinking of keys down the corridor. I tried to reconstruct the timeline of my arrest, searching for the critical vulnerability I had overlooked. I had been so focused on exposing the truth, so consumed by the righteous anger of a betrayed husband, that I had failed to anticipate the speed and ferocity of the system's counterattack. I had assumed that the sheer weight of the evidence I presented at the gala would make it impossible for anyone to cover it up. But I had underestimated the desperate self-preservation of powerful men. The ledger I had displayed did not just contain the names of cheating doctors, it held the secrets of federal prosecutors, influential developers, and several local judges who frequented the Meridian estate. To them, I was not a whistleblower, I was an existential threat that had to be neutralized immediately. The heavy door at the end of the corridor opened, and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of heels signaled the arrival of my visitor. I expected to see Lisa Chang, the sharp-minded defense attorney I had retained to handle the initial divorce proceedings, but when the guard unlocked my cell door, he did not lead me to the attorney-client consultation room. Instead, I was escorted down a narrow hallway into a small, windowless interrogation room. 2 men in dark, tailored suits were already waiting for me, sitting at a gray metal table. The older of the two, a man with silvering hair and cold, calculating blue eyes, introduced himself as Special Agent Harris from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The younger one, who remained standing near the door, was Agent Miller. They did not look like the typical law enforcement officers I had dealt with during my time at the hospital, they carried themselves with the quiet, dangerous confidence of men who operated in the shadows of the federal government. Agent Harris gestured for me to sit down, sliding a thick, blue manila folder across the table toward me. He did not offer any pleasantries. He simply opened the folder to reveal a stack of printouts, including screenshots of the hospital's security logs, the digital footprints of my remote access to the Meridian estate servers, and the encrypted files I had downloaded. Harris leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his eyes locked onto mine. He told me that I was facing charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, specifically Title 18, Section 1033 of the United States Code. He explained that by accessing the private servers of the Meridian estate and the personal devices of hospital staff, I had committed multiple counts of federal wiretapping, economic espionage, and the unauthorized interception of electronic communications. Each count carried a maximum sentence of 10 years, and the prosecution was planning to run them consecutively. I looked at the documents, my heart rate remaining steady despite the gravity of his words. I pointed out that the evidence I uncovered documented a massive, organized blackmail and extortion ring run by Dr. Julian Thorne, a network that was actively victimizing multiple hospital employees. I argued that my actions were protected under whistleblower statutes, as I was exposing criminal activity that compromised the integrity of our healthcare system. Harris let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head slowly. He told me that in the real world, whistleblower protection did not apply to individuals who launch vigilante cyber attacks to settle personal scores. He explained that the moment I displayed those private videos and financial records on the screens at the gala, I crossed the line from a concerned citizen to a hostile actor. He added that several of the individuals listed on the ledger had already filed formal complaints, claiming that the information was entirely fabricated, a sophisticated deepfake operation designed to destroy their reputations. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They were not going to investigate the blackmail ring, they were going to pretend it never existed, and they were going to use my technical expertise as proof that I had the capability to manufacture the entire scandal. Agent Miller stepped forward from the door, his voice low and menacing as he laid out their terms. He told me that the United States Attorney was willing to offer a plea agreement, but only if I cooperated fully. I would have to sign a formal confession admitting that I had fabricated the surveillance footage and the blackmail ledger using advanced artificial intelligence tools. I would also have to plead guilty to a single count of computer fraud, which would carry a recommended sentence of 5 years in a medium security facility. If I refused, they would proceed with the full indictment, ensuring that I would spend the next 30 years of my life behind bars, completely cut off from my daughter. Before I could respond, the door to the interrogation room opened, and Lisa Chong stepped inside, her face pale and her breathing shallow. She immediately demanded that the agent cease the questioning, citing my right to counsel. Harris and Miller did not seem bothered by her sudden intrusion. They slowly stood up, gathered their files, and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my attorney. Lisa sat down in the chair Harris had just vacated, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her briefcase. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and deep concern, whispering that the situation was far worse than she had initially anticipated. She explained that the federal prosecutor assigned to my case was a close associate of Judge Thomas Sterling, one of the prominent figures whose name had appeared on the blackmail ledger I had exposed at the gala. The entire system was rigged against me, and they were moving with terrifying speed to bury the case before the media could dig any deeper. Lisa told me that Evelyn had already filed for an emergency custody hearing, using my arrest as grounds to terminate my parental rights. She had hired a team of high-priced family lawyers who were arguing that my military background and my advanced technical skills made me an unstable, dangerous influence on Chloe. They were claiming that my exposure of the video at the gala was an act of extreme emotional abuse, designed to humiliate my family on a national stage. I felt a surge of hot anger rise in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. I asked Lisa about Clara Kane, hoping that she could provide the financial records that would prove the blackmail payments were real. Lisa shook her head sadly, explaining that Clara had suddenly stopped returning her calls. Rumors were circulating that Marcus Kane had agreed to a quiet, highly lucrative divorce settlement that included a strict non-disclosure agreement, effectively buying Clara's silence and removing our only potential ally. The door to the consultation room opened once more, and a guard announced that my time with my attorney was up, but that I had one more visitor who had been granted special access by the warden. I expected to see my sister, who had been looking after Chloe since my arrest, but instead, Evelyn walked into the room. She was dressed in a tailored cream-colored wool coat, looking every bit the elegant, untouchable physician. There was no trace of the panicked, humiliated woman from the gala. She carried herself with an air of absolute authority and triumph. She sat across from me, her green eyes cold and empty as she looked at my orange jumpsuit. She did not raise her voice, she spoke in a quiet, conversational tone that made my skin crawl. She told me that I had made a critical mistake by assuming that our marriage was a simple partnership that could be dissolved through a standard legal process. She explained that the Syndicate of Healing was not just a social club, it was an alliance of people who understood how the world actually worked, people who protected each other because their survival depended on it. She said that my little stunt at the gala had caused some temporary inconvenience, but the damage was already being repaired. Thorne was going to take the fall for the financial discrepancies, but the rest of them would remain untouched, their reputations preserved by the very courts I had hoped would prosecute them. She then laid out her ultimatum, her voice steady and devoid of any emotion. She promised that if I signed the custody agreement, giving her sole legal and physical custody of Chloe, and if I accepted the federal plea deal without causing any further trouble, she would make sure that my time in prison was comfortable. She would allow me to have supervised visits with Chloe once a year, and she would not pursue my military pension. But if I chose to fight, if I insisted on dragging this through a public trial, she would ensure that I received the maximum sentence possible. She would tell Chloe that her father was a dangerous, mentally unstable criminal who had tried to destroy their family, and she would make sure that I never saw my daughter again. She stood up, smoothing the front of her coat, and looked down at me one last time, telling me that I had 24 hours to make my decision before the formal indictment was handed down. As the guards led me back to my cell, the weight of her words settled heavily on my shoulders. I was a man who had survived combat, who had faced down armed enemies in hostile territory, but I had never felt as helpless as I did in that moment. The system I had trusted, the laws I had sworn to uphold, were being used to systematically strip me of everything I held dear. I lay down on the narrow cot, staring up at the cracked concrete ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the facility. I knew that signing the confession would be a betrayal of everything I stood for, a surrender to the very corruption I had sought to expose. But the thought of losing Chloe, of allowing Evelyn to poison her mind against me, was an unbearable torment. I had 24 hours to decide whether to compromise my integrity to save my relationship with my daughter, or to stand my ground and risk losing her forever in a fight against an enemy that controlled the very rules of the game. Chapter 4. The 24 hours expired with the quiet, devastating finality of a digital countdown reaching zero. When the guard opened my cell door the following morning, I did not ask for the plea agreement paperwork, nor did I request another meeting with Evelyn. I simply stood up, smoothed the wrinkles of my orange jumpsuit, and walked out to meet my fate. I had decided to fight, choosing to believe that the truth, when presented clearly to a jury of my peers, would still hold some measure of power. It was a decision born of stubborn military pride and a father's desperate refusal to let his daughter believe a lie, but it was a decision that would cost me everything. The formal arraignment took place in a federal courtroom that felt more like a cathedral of institutional power than a hall of justice. The walls were lined with dark, polished mahogany, and the high ceilings amplified the murmurs of the prosecutors and spectators. Sitting on the elevated bench was Judge Thomas Sterling, the very man whose name I had seen on the second page of Julian Thorne's blackmail ledger, under a column detailing a payment of $40,000 to suppress an investigation into a real estate conflict of interest. I looked at him, searching for some sign of shame or hesitation, but his face was a mask of cold, judicial arrogance. When Lisa Chung stood to argue for a reasonable bail, pointing to my honorable military service, my lack of a prior criminal record, and my deep ties to the community, the prosecutor immediately intervened. He painted me as a highly dangerous cyber-terrorist, a man with the technical capability to manipulate financial systems, fabricate evidence, and disappear into the wind with encrypted assets. Judge Sterling did not even pretend to deliberate. He set my bail at $5 million, an astronomical sum that he knew was entirely out of my reach, ensuring that I would remain locked in a federal holding cell for the duration of the legal proceedings. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into isolation. The Federal Detention Center was a machine designed to grind a man's sanity into dust. I was permitted only one 15-minute phone call a week, which I used to speak to my sister, desperate for any news of Chloe. But the news was never good. Evelyn had obtained a temporary restraining order, preventing my sister from bringing Chloe to visit me or even letting her speak to me on the phone. My daughter was being kept in a state of complete isolation from my side of the family, surrounded only by Evelyn, her high-priced lawyers, and the quiet, insidious narrative they were weaving about my sudden descent into madness. I spent my days pacing the concrete floor of my cell, measuring the 8-foot space over and over again, trying to visualize the defense strategy that Lisa was struggling to build. Lisa worked tirelessly, but every motion we filed was met with a swift, merciless rejection from Judge Sterling's court. We filed a motion to introduce the cloned phone data from Evelyn's device, which documented the blackmail payments and the existence of the syndicate of healing. The prosecution countered with a motion to suppress, arguing that the data had been obtained through an illegal, warrantless search and seizure in direct violation of the Fourth Amendment and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. They argued that as a private citizen acting without a warrant, I had committed a federal crime to acquire the information, rendering it completely inadmissible in a court of law. I sat at the defense table, watching in disbelief as the prosecutor argued that the law must protect the privacy of citizens from rogue actors like myself, completely ignoring the fact that the privacy they were protecting was a shield for a massive, criminal extortion ring. Judge Sterling ruled in favor of the prosecution, declaring that the cloned data, the surveillance videos from the Meridian estate, and any mention of the blackmail ledger were strictly suppressed and could not be presented to the jury. The devastating blow to our criminal defense was quickly followed by the nightmare of the family court custody hearing. Because it was a civil matter, it was handled in a separate, closed-door courtroom, away from the public eye. I was brought into the room in full shackles, the heavy iron chains clinking against the linoleum floor as I took my seat next to Lisa. Evelyn sat across from us, dressed in a conservative navy blue suit, her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking the picture of a grieving, protective mother. Her attorneys presented a report from a court-appointed child psychologist, a woman whose private practice relied heavily on referrals from the very medical alliance that Evelyn and her colleagues controlled. The report was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It claimed that Chloe was suffering from severe trauma and anxiety, not because of her mother's affair and lies, but because of my sudden, violent exposure of the family's private life at the gala. The psychologist argued that my actions were indicative of a deep-seated, narcissistic desire for control, and that my military background made me a volatile, unpredictable threat to my daughter's emotional well-being. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to look past the lawyers, directly at the judge. I spoke about the 16 years I had spent building a life for my family, about the nights I had stayed up with Chloe when she was sick, and about the promises of honesty and trust that had defined our home. I told the judge that I had only exposed the truth because the lies were destroying our family from the inside out. But my words sounded hollow and desperate in the sterile courtroom, drowned out by the mountain of professional evaluations, legal briefs, and the cold, hard fact of my pending federal indictment. The family court judge, a woman who had served on several civic boards with members of the Medical Alliance, delivered her ruling with a chilling lack of empathy. She awarded Evelyn sole legal and physical custody of Chloe, terminating my parental rights and ordering that I have no contact with my daughter, direct or indirect, until she reached the age of 18. The chains around my ankles felt heavier than they ever had before as the guards led me out of the courtroom, my heart breaking into 1,000 silent pieces. The criminal trial began in the heat of midsummer, but the outcome had been decided long before the first juror was selected. The prosecution's strategy was simple and highly effective. They did not need to prove that Evelyn had not had an affair, or that the blackmail ring did not exist. They simply had to prove that I had accessed the servers and devices without authorization, which I had. To make matters worse, they introduced a forensic software analyst, a paid expert witness who testified that the surveillance video of Evelyn and Marcus Kane showed clear signs of digital manipulation. He used complex technical jargon to confuse the jury, suggesting that I had used advanced artificial intelligence tools to superimpose Evelyn's face onto another woman's body, creating a highly convincing deepfake to destroy her reputation. It was a complete fabrication, a lie designed to discredit the only physical evidence of her betrayal, but without the original, uncorrupted server files, which the Meridian estate had conveniently deleted during a routine system upgrade, we had no way to disprove his testimony. Lisa did her best to cross-examine the witness, pointing out his financial ties to the prosecution's consultants, but the damage was done. The jury, a group of 12 ordinary citizens who knew nothing about cybersecurity or digital forensics, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and disgust. To them, I was a bitter, tech-savvy ex-Marine who had used his skills to stalk his wife, hack her colleagues, and construct an elaborate, malicious hoax to humiliate her on a grand stage. The prosecution closed their case by painting me as a man who believed he was above the law, a dangerous vigilante who had compromised the security of a major medical network to settle a domestic dispute. When the jury retired to deliberate, I sat in the holding cell behind the courtroom, staring at the small, barred window that looked out over the gray Seattle skyline. I knew then that the truth was not a shield, it was a luxury that only the powerful could afford to wield. The system had not failed, it had functioned exactly as it was designed to, protecting the collective interests of those who held the keys to power while crushing the one individual who had dared to disrupt the status quo. The jury returned after only 3 hours of deliberation, their faces solemn as they took their seats. I stood next to Lisa, my shoulders straight and my head held high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. The foreperson read the verdict, finding me guilty on all counts of federal wiretapping, economic espionage, and unauthorized computer access. Judge Sterling looked down at me from his elevated bench, his expression devoid of any human warmth, and sentenced me to 12 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole. As the marshals led me away, the heavy iron door of the courtroom closed behind me, shutting out the light of the world I had fought so hard to protect, and leaving me with nothing but the cold, silent company of my own ruined principles. The chains around my ankles clinked with a heavy, rhythmic monotony as the transport bus rattled along the interstate, the sound vibrating through the steel floor and into the soles of my boots. Outside, the rain-slicked evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest flew past, sliced into tiny, jagged squares by the heavy wire mesh covering the windows. I was one of 34 men dressed in identical, coarse orange jumpsuits, our wrists bound by cold steel handcuffs to a heavy chain wrapped tightly around our waists. The air inside the cabin was thick with the suffocating smell of diesel fumes, damp fabric, and the quiet, desperate resignation of men who had lost everything. We were traveling south, away from Seattle, toward the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon. Every mile we covered felt like a physical tearing, a violent separation from the life I had built, from the career I had respected, and most of all, from my 9-year-old daughter, Chloe. I stared out the window, watching the familiar gray mist of my home state dissolve into the dark, indifferent pine forests of the Oregon wilderness. I was a 42-year-old former Marine, a man who had survived the harsh, unpredictable sands of foreign battlefields and the complex, invisible warfare of cybersecurity, yet nothing in my life had prepared me for the sheer, crushing weight of this systemic defeat. The intake process at Sheridan was a cold, clinical exercise in stripping away whatever remained of my humanity. To the guards who processed me, I was no longer Nick Ellery, the decorated veteran or the hospital security chief who had tried to expose a corrupt blackmail ring. I was simply register number 48912, a convicted federal felon serving a 144-month sentence. They took my fingerprints, photographed my face from 2 angles under harsh, humming fluorescent lights, and conducted a deeply humiliating strip search designed to establish absolute, unquestioned dominance. I was handed a set of faded olive drab scrubs, a thin, lumpy mattress, and a single rough wool blanket that smelled of industrial bleach. My new home was an 8-by-10-foot concrete cell in the medium security unit, a windowless box that I was to share with a silent, middle-aged man who was serving 15 years for a nonviolent financial crime. As the heavy steel door slid shut with a deafening, mechanical crash, the finality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The rigid, unyielding routine of prison life quickly became my only anchor in the ocean of my confinement. I woke up every morning at 5 o'clock, long before the official wake-up call, to perform a grueling regimen of push-ups, sit-ups, and pull-ups using the cold metal frame of my bunk. It was a physical discipline I resurrected from my days in the Marine Corps, a deliberate effort to keep my body strong and my mind focused on survival. The rest of my day was a monotonous, soul-crushing cycle of head counts, tasteless meals in the noisy, chaotic chow hall, and hours spent working in the prison laundry for 12 cents an hour. I embraced the physical labor, using the repetitive, exhausting motion of folding heavy sheets and sorting stained uniforms to quiet the storm of anger and betrayal that raged constantly in my chest. But the physical hardships of Sheridan were nothing compared to the emotional torment of the silence from the outside world. Once a week, I was permitted to receive mail, and every Tuesday evening, I waited with a desperate, agonizing hope for a letter from my sister, Sarah. Her letters were my only connection to my daughter, but they were also a source of profound, quiet grief. Sarah wrote that Evelyn had completely consolidated her control over Chloe's life, shielding her from any contact with my side of the family. Chloe had been enrolled in an exclusive, high-security private boarding school in California, far away from the gossip and the scandal of the Seattle medical community. Evelyn had changed her phone number, blocked my sister from all forms of communication, and hired a private security firm to monitor the school grounds. In her rare, hard-won updates, Sarah described how Chloe was adjusting to her new life, but the details were devastating to my heart. Chloe had been told that I was a dangerous, mentally unstable criminal who had tried to destroy her mother out of pure malice and jealousy. My daughter was being taught to fear me, to view her father as a monster who belonged behind bars. The realization that my attempt to expose the truth had only succeeded in alienating my daughter was a slow-acting poison that seeped into my soul, turning my righteous anger into a bitter, hollow regret. While I decayed in my concrete cell, the people who had destroyed my family were thriving, protected by the very system I had tried to warn. I spent my limited free hours in the prison library, searching through national newspapers and medical journals for any mention of the Pacific Northwest Medical Alliance. The news I found was a testament to the absolute victory of the corrupt elite. Dr. Evelyn Vance had not lost her medical license. Instead, she had been promoted to regional director of the alliance, her reputation as a dedicated humanitarian fully restored by a series of carefully managed public relations campaigns. Dr. Marcus Kane had quietly resigned from his position, only to be hired as the chief medical officer for a major pharmaceutical conglomerate in Chicago, his career entirely unaffected by the scandal. Even Dr. Julian Thorne, the mastermind behind the blackmail ring, had managed to negotiate a plea deal that allowed him to serve his sentence in a minimum security camp with a country club atmosphere, his wealth and connections shielding him from the harsh reality of real incarceration. The judges, the politicians, and the executives who had frequented the Meridian estate had successfully buried the ledger, their names erased from the public record by the very courts that had sentenced me. Lisa Chong did not give up on me, but her efforts were like throwing pebbles at a massive fortress wall. Every appeal we filed with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals was summarily dismissed without a hearing. The legal system had closed ranks, protecting its own with a seamless, impenetrable solidarity. They argued that the evidence of my hacking was overwhelming and that the public interest was best served by keeping a dangerous cybercriminal behind bars. Lisa visited me once every 3 months, her face growing more tired and defeated with each visit. During our last meeting, she sat behind the scratched plexiglass partition in the visitor's room, her voice crackling through the cheap intercom as she told me that we had exhausted all legal avenues. There would be no retrial, no reduction in sentence, and no miracle. I was going to serve every single day of my 12-year sentence. The ultimate realization of my absolute defeat came on a cold evening in late December, during my second year of incarceration. I was sitting in the quiet corner of the prison library, flipping through a local Seattle lifestyle magazine that had been donated to the facility. On the cover was a photograph of Evelyn, smiling warmly as she accepted an award for her outstanding contributions to public health. Standing beside her, holding her hand and smiling brightly for the camera, was Chloe. My daughter had grown taller, her face losing the soft roundness of childhood and taking on the sharp, intelligent features of her mother. She looked happy, healthy, and completely detached from the man who was sitting in a federal prison cell, wearing a faded green uniform and clutching a cheap magazine. In that moment, the final, stubborn embers of my anger died, replaced by a cold, heavy acceptance. I had believed that exposing the truth would bring justice, that the light would naturally dispel the darkness. But I had been wrong. In the real world, the truth was a fragile, easily crushed thing, and those who dared to wield it without the protection of power would only find themselves crushed beneath its weight. I folded the magazine, returned it to the metal shelf, and walked back to my cell, knowing that the man who had walked into that Seattle Convention Center 2 years ago was dead, and that the only thing left for me to do was to learn how to survive in the silence of my own defeat. 10 years and 6 months of my 12-year sentence had passed before the heavy iron gates of Sheridan Federal Correctional Institution finally slid open to let me walk back into the free world. I was 52 years old, my hair completely silvered at the temples, my shoulders slightly stooped from a decade of hard labor and the heavy, invisible weight of a broken spirit. The world I stepped into was faster, louder, and colder than the one I had left behind. The city of Seattle had grown, its skyline dominated by new, gleaming tech towers that seemed to mock the obsolete skills of a former cybersecurity chief whose credentials had been permanently revoked by a federal felony conviction. I was released on strict parole, assigned to a cramped, damp studio apartment in a rundown corner of South Seattle, and ordered to report to a parole officer twice a week. My military pension was gone, stripped from me to pay the mountain of court fees and the lifetime alimony awarded to Evelyn. I survived by working at a dusty, cluttered electronics repair shop owned by an aging veteran named Arthur, who did not care about my criminal record as long as I could solder circuit boards and replace cracked smartphone screens for $10 an hour. Every day, as I sat under the flickering fluorescent lights of the repair shop, my hands covered in grease and solder, my mind remained anchored to a single, burning obsession. I needed to see Chloe. She was 20 years old now, a young woman who had spent more than half her life under the absolute, unchallenged influence of her mother. I had promised myself during those long, dark nights in my prison cell that I would not try to force my way back into her life, but the biological pull of a father's love was a force I could not suppress. I did not use my old hacking tools to find her. The terms of my federal parole monitored my internet usage with a relentless, automated scrutiny that would have sent me straight back to prison at the first sign of suspicious digital activity. Instead, I used public records, local university directories, and the simple, patient observation of a man who had nothing left but time. I discovered that Chloe was a junior at the University of Washington, majoring in biochemistry and pre-medical studies. She was following the path her mother had paved for her, moving through the world of elite academia with the effortless confidence of the wealthy and privileged. On a cold, rain-slicked Tuesday afternoon, I took the bus to the university campus. The red brick pathways were crowded with young students hurrying between classes, their laughter and bright umbrellas creating a vibrant, energetic contrast to the gray, depressing mist that hung over the city. I stood near the entrance of the biochemistry building, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my worn canvas jacket, my eyes scanning every face that emerged from the heavy double doors. When she finally walked out, my heart stopped. She was beautiful, taller than I remembered, her long auburn hair falling in soft waves over the shoulders of an expensive wool coat. She was walking with a group of friends, laughing at something a young man next to her had said. She had my green eyes, but her posture, her confident, measured stride, and the elegant tilt of her chin were entirely Evelyn's. I felt a sudden, suffocating wave of emotion wash over me, a mixture of profound pride and devastating grief. I waited until her friends drifted away toward the library, leaving her to walk alone down the quiet, tree-lined path toward the student union. I stepped out from the shadow of a large elm tree, my boots squeaking softly on the wet pavement. I called her name, my voice cracking slightly with the weight of 10 years of unspoken love. Chloe stopped. She turned slowly, her brow furrowing in confusion as she looked at the gray-haired man standing before her in a faded jacket. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a shadow of the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders and color drawings of horses at our kitchen island. But then, as her mind processed my face, her expression hardened into something cold, distant, and terrifyingly familiar. She did not step back in fear, instead, she looked at me with a calm, clinical disgust that made my blood run cold. She asked me what I was doing there, her voice carrying the same icy, aristocratic cadence that Evelyn had used during our final meeting in the interrogation room. I took a step closer, my hands raised in a peaceful gesture, and told her that I just wanted to see her, to let her know that I had never stopped thinking about her, and that I had never stopped loving her. I told her that the stories her mother had told her were not the whole truth, that I had only ever wanted to protect our family from the lies that were destroying us. Chloe let out a soft, bitter laugh, a sound that cut deeper than any physical blow I had ever received. She told me to stop talking, her voice rising slightly but remaining entirely under control. She said that she had read the court transcripts, that she had seen the forensic reports proving that I had fabricated the explicit videos to humiliate her mother, and that she knew exactly what kind of man I was. She told me that her mother had spent the last 10 years rebuilding their lives from the wreckage I had caused, protecting her from the toxic, controlling shadow of a father who was nothing more than a convicted felon and a delusional stalker. I tried to speak, to tell her about the blackmail ledger, about Julian Thorne, and about the $50,000 of her college fund that Evelyn had paid to cover up her affair, but Chloe cut me off with a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand. She told me that she had legally changed her name to Vance on her 18th birthday, completely erasing any connection to the name Ellery. She said that she was proud of her mother, who had survived my abuse and gone on to do incredible things for the community. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that she was currently working as an intern for the Thorne Foundation, a massive mental health nonprofit that was helping thousands of families overcome trauma. The realization of her words hit me with the force of a physical collapse. Dr. Julian Thorne, the man who had run the corrupt blackmail ring at the Meridian estate, had not been destroyed by my exposure. After serving a brief, comfortable sentence in a minimum security facility, he had been fully rehabilitated in the public eye. His rebranded foundation was now a highly respected, multi-million-dollar charity, and my own daughter was working for him, completely oblivious to the fact that he had once extorted her mother. The system had not just survived my attack, it had absorbed the scandal, repurposed it, and used it to create an even more powerful, untouchable network of influence. Chloe stepped closer to me, her green eyes flashing with a cold, protective anger. She told me that if I ever approached her again, if I ever dared to show my face on her campus or near her home, she would personally call the campus security and her mother's private security team. She said that her mother was currently running for the United States Senate, and that they would not allow a bitter, broken ex-con to disrupt the campaign with his pathetic, desperate lies. She told me that I was nothing to her, a stranger who had tried to ruin her life before she was even old enough to understand, and that she wanted me to stay dead to her, just as I had been for the last 10 years. She turned on her heel and walked away, her expensive boots clicking sharply on the wet brick path, leaving me standing alone in the freezing rain. I watched her figure disappear into the crowd of students, her bright umbrella blending in with the others until she was completely gone. I stood there for a long time, the cold water soaking through my canvas jacket and chilling me to the bone, but I did not feel the cold. I felt only a vast, empty numbness. As I rode the bus back to my quiet studio apartment, I looked out the window at the passing city streets. On a giant billboard overlooking the interstate, a massive campaign advertisement caught my eye. It was a portrait of Evelyn, looking radiant, strong, and deeply compassionate. Beside her stood Chloe, smiling proudly as she leaned against her mother's shoulder. The slogan printed in bold, elegant letters beneath their picture read, "Strength through truth, supporting survivors of domestic abuse." The ultimate, sickening irony of my life was laid bare before me on that giant piece of vinyl. My attempt to expose the corruption of the elite had not brought them down. Instead, it had provided Evelyn with the perfect, unimpeachable narrative of victimization that she had used to propel herself to the absolute pinnacle of political power. My destruction had been the foundation of her ultimate success. I had lost my daughter, my career, my reputation, and my freedom, while the monsters who had betrayed me were celebrated as heroes, their sins fully washed away by the very public they were exploiting. I walked up the creaking stairs to my dark, empty apartment, sat on the edge of my narrow bed, and looked at my calloused, sawdust-stained hands. I had won the war of information, but the world did not care about the truth. The world cared about power, and in that arena, I had been utterly, completely, and permanently defeated.